This morning, we're continuing our live in-depth interview we started last week with a Mississippi State University professor of finance. We're comparing today's soaring inflation to the crisis in the late 1970s. And we're happy to welcome back Dr. Tom Miller, Jr. for the second part of this live interview. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on.
So you not only have expertise in the field of economics, but you also personally remember the last inflation crisis. And around that time, you had just finished earning your master's degree. But let me ask you first about some news that happened yesterday, or it was last week, when the stock market saw its biggest decline in nearly 2 years on last Wednesday, when the Dow dropped by more than 1,100 points. So what do you think were the primary causes of this large drop?
Well, the market does fluctuate, but yesterday was a pretty dramatic fall. But basically, I think there are two effects. One, the stock market is always forward-looking and trying to predict economic conditions off into the future. So if the market thinks there will be less production in the future, less profits for companies, it reacts downwards today. And the second effect is as interest rates increases, future cash flows are less valuable today, so prices will fall.
Yeah. So what caused the current inflation crisis? And what caused the one that happened 40 years ago?
You asked me that last time, and I'm still trying to think of what did cause it 40 years ago. But this time around, I would say it was pretty much in 40 years ago, there was, we had a war in Vietnam, and we had energy shocks and whatnot, the oil embargoes, et cetera, kind of helped set off the stimulus or set things off. But this time around, the reaction basically to fight COVID by injecting a bunch of money into the money supply basically gave more people more money to spend. And as they spend that money, that does put pressure upwards on prices.
Yeah.
And so, but then as prices stay up, inflation is like a pay cut. We have to make our budget stretch farther, and it gets harder over time. And
Yeah.
what'll happen is eventually we'll have less discretionary income, like fund money, vacation money, and the like. And as we buy less, less is produced. And if less is produced, we don't need as many workers. I worked for a glass company back in 40 years ago, and we made glass. Glass is used in buildings and in vehicles.
Yeah.
And not many of those things were being sold at the time. So making less of each meant we didn't sell as much glass, and we had to lay off people. And so that's kind of the longer term effect of an inflationary cycle. And I think we're still just at the beginning. And people are trying to make adjustments by cutting back on what kind of paper products, for example, they might purchase and et cetera. But it is, as I said last time, I think we should prepare to think that we're at the beginning of the cycle, not at the end. And the one thing that I fear the most is wage and price controls, which I reached for in the 70s. President Nixon put on wage and price controls in the 70s. I believe President Reagan repealed them 10 years later. They're supposed to be temporary, but they caused all kinds of problems. If you go back and Google gas shortages, et cetera, and the various rationing attempts that were made and schemes that we had, instead of just letting price allocate the goods, we tried to artificially allocate, and that was an issue.
So we've talked about the administration and the federal government 40 years ago, but right now, what do you think about the Fed's strategy to raise interest rates to, combat this?
Well, as the rates increase, what that does is it chokes off future money or future investment into businesses to hire people, et cetera. So it cools off the economy by slowing it down.
Yeah.
So it's a long-term solution. It's not a short thing. But that's what the Fed can do for monetary policy. That's their main inflation-fighting tool, and it's pretty slow.
And it is a long process, like you said. Do you think this one could last longer than the last one 40 years ago?
Well, gee, that one last time, that was a long cycle, and I hope that we've learned things from
Yeah.
that and that policymakers can can just write it out. That's what we eventually had to do in the early 80s was just kind of suffer through a period where we still had high inflation, high unemployment, budgets were being stretched, but over time that got better. And so there's kind of a rough patch that we will have to go through to wring inflation out of the system.
Yeah.
And I think that's some time away, actually.
Well, Dr. Miller, it's been great having you join us again.
I've enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too.